Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Happy New Year. Welcome to the Washington Policy Pulse, the first one of the 2025. We want to certainly say thank you for coming back to join us in 2025 now that the election is over. I know a lot of the excitement, well, the excitement still may be here, but a lot of the excitement may also have gone away a little bit. But, with 1 week until Inauguration Day here in Washington, we certainly have a lot to talk about. Again, my name is Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst here in the Washington office. We're going to be talking about just generally what's happening in Washington, committee hearings, speeches, our research, anything you want to know. If you are on this call as we're doing it, please feel free to use the chat function, the Q&A function. And if you're watching this call on the terminal later, you can always reach out to us via IB to follow up with questions. So joining me on the call is Matt Schettenhelm. He is our TMT expert in policy and litigation. I'm going to bring him in just a minute to talk about the TikTok ban. He was over at the Supreme Court on Friday listening to the justices speak, so he can give you a preview of whether or not TikTok is going to happen, or the TikTok ban is going to happen by January 19th, or is there any avenue that President Trump could try and stop it and so forth like that. But let me go ahead and get started on what we're anticipating this week. Well, this is confirmation hearing week. There are a lot of confirmation hearings going on. I'm not going to go through them all, but it's all going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tuesday, the big ones, we have Pete Hegseth for the Secretary of Defense, Doug Collins of the VA, Doug Burgum for Interior. Wednesday, Kristi Noem for Homeland Security. Pam Bondi has both Wednesday and Thursday. She actually has two hearings for Attorney General, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And then on Thursday, we have Scott Bessent over at Treasury and Elise Stefanik at the Ambassador for the UN. And still TBD, we have, Patel at FBI, Tulsi Gabbard at the DNI, and then also, people like Howard Lutnick at Commerce and Linda McMahon at the Department of Education. So the current thinking right now is that a lot of the Senate Republicans are going to be trying to push the national security picks sooner rather than later. So don't be surprised. There's been talk that Senator Rubio and Ambassador nominee Elise Stefanik could potentially get in on Inauguration Day through unanimous consent. The thought here is that, just these picks aren't really all that controversial, and certainly you could see some Democratic support for them as well. Just as a reminder, the Senate has 53 to 47, but Senator or Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has resigned his seat. So until Governor DeWine of Ohio names his replacement, the Republicans can only afford to lose 3 votes. Because remember, it's 53 to 47, but the Vice President is the one that does the tie, and so you can only afford to lose 3 votes in that scenario. But we do think a lot of these picks are going to go through. I think if you were to ask me which picks wouldn't go through, I think it's really a lot of the focus is going to be on Tulsi Gabbard at the DNI. Dwayne Wright, who was our healthcare analyst, was just telling me a little bit earlier that he thinks RFK is going to go through, RFK Jr. for the Department of Health and Human Services. We've seen statements from Senator Fetterman open to the idea. Senator Cory Booker has actually said some positive statements about RFK Jr., but it really looks like Tulsi Gabbard is going to have the most difficult hearing. But, Pete Hegseth over at Secretary of Defense could also have a difficult hearing. From the investable angle, what we're paying attention to is not so much the personality of the hearing, but the policy. And so as we watch these hearings, and I'm going to pick on Scott Bessent over at Treasury because he's the one that I'm most interested in through my portfolio, the questions I'm going to be looking for him to answer are on tax reform and tariffs. Tax reform, obviously, if you've been on this call before, this idea of paying for $4.5 trillion to have tax extensions. How are you going to pay for it, and so forth. So that's what's going on with the confirmation hearings. Second thing that's come up just about this tax reform and this reconciliation package, prior to the holidays, if you were on this call or if you got my email, the last one I sent in 2024, I said that the current thinking right now amongst the Republicans is that you were going to have a 2-step reconciliation package. Step 1, the reconciliation bill for part 1 would be border, security, immigration, and domestic energy production. Step 2 would be tax reform. Now, the House Republican view was to do it all one big, beautiful bill, and that has convinced President Trump to try that approach. So now we're back to the one reconciliation bill. So they want to get it done within the first 100 days. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said that he wants a vote by late April, could bleed into May. I'm just not exactly sure that they can get there. Look, when the House, you only have 5 individuals in the House, and several of them are leaving to go take positions in the cabinet. You only have a handful of folks, and so I do think this is going to take a little bit longer. And don't be surprised if this goes into the second or third or fourth quarter of this year, because in terms of actual dates that are forcing Congress to act, I mean, just remember, when it comes to Washington, Congress doesn't like to act unless it has to. But in terms of dates, you have the X date for the debt ceiling, which could be sometime this summer. You have the tax reforms of December 31st, 2025, and then you have the government shutdown, which is in March. Those are the dates where it actually is forcing Congress to do something. Until then, Congress can always debate and always wait for another day. So this one reconciliation bill is the idea. If you're a policy wonk, if you're interested, Representative Arrington of the House Budget Committee released a one-pager last week where he laid out $5 trillion of potential cuts. A lot of that was in Dwayne Wright's healthcare space, so if you're in the healthcare space, certainly talk to Dwayne. But they even put in that document, if you will, like EV tax credits. Sorry, not EV tax credits, clean energy tax credits. They even put in that document subject to political approval. So they recognize this may be difficult as well. If you want to see that document, please let me know. It's out in the public forum. I can certainly send you the link to it as well. Last thing I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Matt is executive orders. Now, on January 20th, the way it's going to work is President Trump is going to take the swearing-in ceremony at noon up on Capitol Hill. They're going to go have a lunch over at the Capitol, and then he's going to do the parade where he walks from the Capitol down to the White House. That generally takes about an hour, hour and a half. If you recall, the first time he did this, he actually got into the car, drove a little bit, got out of the car, got into the car, but they move at a very slow pace. So don't anticipate the president entering the White House until probably around 2, 3 o'clock-ish, and I'm just making that guesstimate. At that point, President Trump is going to start doing executive orders. Now, President Biden had 7 executive orders between January 20th and January 21st, and we think President Trump is probably going to be around the same. Now, these are 4 broad areas that we think that these executive orders are going to focus on, and we've talked about this in our research. First is trade and tariffs. Now, President Trump can sign a tariff or an agreement saying that we think these tariffs are, or he can say an executive order saying 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada. We've looked into it. All he has to do is call customs, and customs has to go to a computer and input 25%, hit enter, and those tariffs are instantaneous. But it's our view that in that executive order, he's going to still leave the room open for negotiation. There are a lot of ways that he can do tariffs, and Holly Fromm has written about this extensively. But more often than not, we think that in that executive order, it's going to say, we direct the Department of Commerce to do a study, and then that study takes 2 to 3 months, and then it comes back. Just like last week, it was reported that President Trump was going to declare an economic disaster, which will allow him to implement tariffs almost instantly. He did this back in 2019 when it came to Mexico. Representatives from Mexico City came up to Washington. They negotiated over immigration policy, and those tariffs never came to fruition. So I think the executive order information when it comes to tariffs is still going to give us 2 to 3 months to figure it out. Secondly is energy. If you don't know Rob Barnett or Vince Piazza or Will Hares, last week I joined the BI Energy Chat, similar to this type of call. They do this every Wednesday, where we talked about what could be done in the energy sector. President Trump has said that he wants to open up the Alaska National Life Refuge, do some permitting reform and so forth. When it comes to the energy sector in particular, there's a lot more power of the presidency when it comes to executive orders. So definitely, if you want to talk to our energy colleagues about that, I can put you in touch with them. Immigration. Now, we don't talk about immigration all that much from a BI perspective because it's very difficult to do an investable angle. Our colleagues over at Bloomberg Economics, they actually sit like 3 rows over there, have been doing a lot of macro level work on immigration in terms of supply and demand and so forth like that. But do you anticipate that immigration is going to be one of the executive orders that President Trump puts out, just because it's a policy decision and that is within the purview of the president? Just remember, if it's a funding decision, it's Congress. If it's a policy decision, it's the president. So President Trump can change the policy of immigration, and he can do that fairly quickly. But when it comes to additional funding, that has to be due through Congress. And then finally, if you're a federal government employee here in the Washington, D.C. area, we've heard rumors that there's an executive order coming out ordering you back to work 5 days a week. But again, 80% of the federal workforce is not in the Washington, D.C. area. But again, we anticipate that executive order could potentially come out as well. So I'm going to pause there. Again, put any questions in, but Matt, You were over at the TikTok hearing. I ask you constantly whether or not TikTok is going to get banned. I think there's a lot of folks that have children that want to know if TikTok is going to be banned. Will TikTok get banned?
Yeah, I was popular with my 15-year-old son and his friend in the car on our drive to basketball practice this weekend because they were asking me that same question. So I think it's very bleak right now for TikTok. We went into this argument saying that TikTok had a 30% chance of winning this case and dodging the ban. I walked out of the argument lowering TikTok's chances to 20%. When you looked at the questions from the 9 Supreme Court justices, you could only really see one that was potentially strongly in TikTok's favor, Justice Gorsuch. Very hard to do the math to get up to 5 votes there. And on the other hand, much easier to get up to 5 votes from the United States side. The Chief Justice, in particular, very strong voice. And that was consistent with what we expected going into the argument based on how the DC Circuit had decided it in December. So looks really tough for TikTok. What happens now if they lose the case? So the ban is set to take effect on January 19th, so 6 days on Sunday now. With the Supreme Court, it doesn't usually work this fast, the Supreme Court. So we don't really know when we're going to see the ruling from the Supreme Court. There was a possibility late Friday. There was a possibility this morning. It didn't come in either of those. It could pop up anytime in the docket. The court has announced that Wednesday is an opinion day. And so it's possible they release it then. Possible they even try to write a full opinion on the First Amendment within whatever it is, 4 or 5 days, which is not how this court usually operates. So either way, I do expect we should get a decision by January 19th in some form. TikTok has asked the court to pause the deadline and try to push it into the Trump administration. Uh, yeah, I think it's very unlikely they're going to do that. And so that just raises the question, can President Trump then do anything after he takes office? So the ban's going to take effect January 19th. On that day, any company that, assuming the Supreme Court doesn't stop it, any company that hosts TikTok in an app store or otherwise makes it available to Americans for maintenance or for use is potentially subject to significant liability, reaching the hundreds of billions of dollars. The math is $5,000 per user. There are 170 million users. So the math is absurd. Huge risk for companies to continue to distribute the app as of January 19th. Trump could come in and say, look, I'm not going to enforce this this law anymore. But the question is, are the companies willing to undertake that much risk, accrue that much liability on the hope that Trump won't reverse himself, on the hope that in 5 years, maybe under a new administration, that new administration doesn't reverse itself. And as a company, I think you have to really think twice about taking on that kind of liability exposure. So I'm real skeptical that that Trump can actually do anything. The one path forward, there are 2 paths forward. One is ByteDance could agree to do a full divestiture, but so far there's been no indication that China is willing to allow that or that ByteDance is willing to pursue it. That would be a path forward, a sale of TikTok. That's the path this law envisions. The other one is that Congress could change the law and Trump could go take it back to the Senate and the House and ask them for, let's give it another year, or let's change the remedy or something like that. I'm still skeptical that that's going to happen when you look at how this passed by such bipartisan majorities in both the House and Senate. So Trump has a warm spot in his heart, he told us, for TikTok, but the law is the law. And so I don't really see a path for TikTok to avoid a ban as of January 19th, unless the Supreme Court, surprises us with a ruling in the company's favor.
That's great, Matt. And Bloomberg News was just reporting that Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank was down at Mar-a-Lago this past weekend talking about potentially trying to pay or put together a group that would buy TikTok. Last thing I want to talk about, I know we've run 5 minutes over. I'm going to really try and keep it to 10 minutes this year, but the last thing I want to talk about is SALT deduction. Andrew Silverman's done a lot of work on this. For those of you in New York and New Jersey, some of the Republican members, the Salty Caucus, if you they're calling it around here, was down at Mar-a-Lago this week. The SALT deduction cap is at 10,000. President Trump has reportedly been floating this idea of 20,000. The Salty Caucus has been coming back with either no cap or 100,000. Where I'm going with this is that they're talking about it, and stay tuned. We'll have Andrew on the call to talk about it a lot more in the next couple of weeks. So next week on Monday, there's we have inauguration day. It's also Martin Luther King Day, so the Bloomberg offices are closed. We're not going to do a policy call on that day, but stay tuned. If a lot of stuff comes up in the inauguration speech, we may try and do a quick reaction call on Tuesday. So if you're on my newsletter, you'll get a copy, an invitation to that. So thank you very much again for attending. We really appreciate it, and I wish you a great week. Thank you.